Hello and welcome to a Culture This tutorial on how to make sauerkraut. Today we're going to make a special pink sauerkraut which will have onion and cabbage and carrot and will taste fabulous. Now traditionally all you need to make sauerkraut is just a bit of white cabbage like this and some salt. But you can use other types of cabbage. You can use red cabbage as well. It ferments just as well as the white cabbage, but it gives it a bit of color as well, which I like. And you can throw in other vegetables as well because the bacteria will ferment these just as well. We're going to throw some carrot. Carrot's quite good. It gives it a little bit of texture, but also it's got quite a lot of sugars in it, which helps the bacteria along. It gives them something extra to feed on. I'm going to throw the onion in there. Now, I'm being quite brave. I'm putting 3 of these bad boys in there. Now, the thing is, when you put something in sauerkraut, like a garlic or an onion, you'll find that 1 clove will actually have a lot of potency in your kraut. So it'll really be pungent and add a lot to it. So, experiment with caution, but I'm going to go for it today. I think it's going to be really good. We'll cut a lot of onion in there. So the first thing to do is to just set all that aside. Just get your cabbage and just chop it in half. And then chop it into a quarter like that. And then sort of take out that notch from the core like that. And just set that aside. We'll use those later. And chop them out like that, because they'll be useful later on. And then to get your shred, you literally just get your kraut like this and just start slicing down thin little slices. It doesn't really matter how thin you make them, because you're just making surface area for the salt and for the crushing process later on. But I generally find the finer you make it, it does tend to ferment that little bit better. Right, so that's all that. So, I've chopped all that cabbage up into a couple of bowls there. I'm a little worried about containers actually. You'll note I'm using glass or ceramic, no metal. Metal tends to interact with the cabbage and sometimes it goes a bit blue, which is a bit strange. So, stay away from metal, and we tend to stay away from plastics just because I don't like using plastics around food if I can avoid it. So, next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our onions and just start chopping those same way. Basically, work your way across the onions. Okay, so we've chopped up those onions and distributed them evenly between the 2 bowls there. We've grated a couple of carrots and put them in there as well. So now all we need to do is put some salt in the mixture there. We tend to use sea salt, unrefined, because it's just, as far as I'm concerned, the best kind you can. Now, there's a lot of debate as to how much you want to use in sauerkraut. Some people use quite a lot, some people use not very much at all. I'm sort of in the middle. I generally find that you can get pretty decent kraut with about a tablespoon for every kilogram of vegetable that you've got. I've done it with even a bit less and it still works, because the main thing the salt's doing is creating a slightly antimicrobial environment. It won't harm the lactic acid bacteria that we're trying to protect here, but what it will do is it'll prevent other bacteria from populating your kraut, whilst the lactic acid bacteria start to populate and start to do their work, and they will eventually generate an anaerobic environment inside the pot, which will then make it unconducive to other bacteria. So it's the lactic acid bacteria that already exist within cabbage and other brassicas that are actually doing the heavy work, and the salt you're putting in there is just giving them a helping hand. Theoretically, you don't need the salt, but I've never tried that. I wouldn't recommend it. The salt does a couple of other things as well. It helps the vegetables keep their crunch, so they stay a little bit crunchier when you put some salt in there. And it also helps draw the moisture out of the vegetables by osmosis. So it draws out the water so that you get a little brine from the juices of the cabbage and the juices of the various vegetables you put in there, as opposed to having to add water and salt, which I've never had to do. So looking at these, I've sort of, typically a bowl like that, I do just under a tablespoon. You'll note I'm not very scientific about it, because to be honest, it doesn't really matter hugely as long as you've got some in there. And that will literally do it. We don't need lots in there. And that's it. So the next quite critical thing you need to do, obviously, is mix all this together. And then you need to start, once you've got a good mix, you need to start crushing it. Okay, and the crushing is quite important, because the crushing helps draw out the liquid, but also the crushing starts to break down the cell walls of the cabbage and break it down, its very structure. And that will make it easier then for the bacteria to get in there and start digesting away. It makes it easier for them to kind of swim in there and do what they do. And I found that the more you crush it, as opposed to just let it do its own thing, the better and stronger fermentation you get. You might even be able to hear it. I mean, if you come a bit if you go a bit closer, you might even be able to hear. Really give it a good crush like that, and just keep doing it until basically you don't hear that sound anymore. Good way to work out those forearms, good way to get strong hands and improve your grip and get your life's frustrations out in your crowd. So, okay, so actually just with a literally 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes of good strong crushing, you'll find that it starts to go a bit limp. That crunch is not really that crunchy anymore, and it's starting to go a bit wet. You see it glistening there, and if you give it a good squeeze, you can start to see bits of liquid coming out of it, see? As you give it a good squeeze. So then you know you're basically there. So once it's like that, I tend to sort of just leave it for about 30-40 minutes, just for the salt to keep drawing out some liquid. And what you'll find at the end of that is you'll start to get some liquid at the bottom, which is brine, and that will help you when you start to pack it into the jar. Okay, so we have now had this sat in the bowl for a couple of hours, and usually you get the effect after as little as half an hour, but a couple of hours, make sure you get lots of that kind of brine in there. So we've got some liquid pooling at the bottom, which should make it really easy to submerge the cabbage. So what we're going to do now is just get all this and stuff it into a jar. Now you can use a mason jar, and you can also get kind of specific sauerkraut crocks, which are quite expensive, and I've not invested in one yet. But I find that these, for me, work the best. Because what will happen is what you're going to do is you're going to pack in your sauerkraut in there, and you're going to crush it down to get the brine to cover the sauerkraut. And what I was talking about before is that the bacteria will create an anaerobic environment in this, so it'll be releasing a lot of CO2, and that gas will build up inside the jar. And because the design of the jar is designed to keep it clamped, if it gets too much, it'll just release just a little bit like that. So you'll find that it will never kind of explode or anything like that, and it'll release just enough pressure, but at the same time it'll be tight enough to keep the environment steady in there, which is just what we want. All I've done with this is I've sterilized it just with some boiling water. Strictly speaking, it's not necessary to sterilize your jars, but I find it makes it extra secure against things like mold and other things like that. So long as I kind of sterilize it, I've never had any kind of mold in my sauerkraut, so I find it's a good way to make sure that it stays nice and clean. So all we'll do is literally just get that and just start shoving it in there. Now what you'll find is at first it'll pile up quite high, and you think, oh god, it's not going to fit very much. And what you do then, you just kind of get your fist in there, crush it right down, and as you get down, you'll hear it start to, that's it, and you see how much you can compress down. And as you keep doing that, what you'll find eventually is after the third or fourth, when you crush it down, you'll find that the liquid will start coming up. I'm not sure if you can see it in the camera there, but you might see that there's this kind of purple brine starting to come up over the vegetables there, which is quite good. So you see we're getting very close now to the top, so we'll just fill this up here, just like this. And you see there, look, easily, plenty there to go around in terms of brine. We'll just pour the rest of that in there, and there you go. Now, what you want to do is you want to keep this submerged like that. You don't want it floating back up. Make sure you wash your hands before you do this, by the way, which I have. So to keep that pressed down, we're going to use just a couple of these sort of cores that we kept aside from before, and a couple of adder leaves which I set aside from before as well. I should give them a rinse before you do it. And all you do is you shove one of these things in there, and that's just going to act as a bit of a platform. And you might use a couple if you want to be extra robust about it. And I find it useful to just really ram it down, because what you're doing with this is not just keeping it submerged. When you press it, you're pushing out any hint of air, because you don't want any oxygen in amongst the cabbage if at all possible. You want to make sure it's really all liquid in there to give it room. So you'll see that it's kept it under there. You get yourself one of these, you just plant it in there, in the middle, and you just shut that lid like that, and that'll stop it rising up, and it'll keep it nicely submerged. Now what you find, the next question you might have is, well, how do I know in a couple of weeks if that's actually working? What's it going to look like? What's it going to do? Well, the first thing it'll do is you'll start noticing on the inside there, the minute you'll see no bubbles at all, you'll start noticing little pockets of bubbles appearing in the glass, which is quite useful to use these glass jars because you can see the progress. And you'll notice as well that once it's fermented, it's got a pinkish color. So when I first made this one, you'll see that it was exactly like that. It had that kind of purple color, whereas you can see when it's fermented, it's very pink. And you can see as well the liquid's got that kind of really clear pink color to it there. And you'll see as well there's no kind of mold or anything in this. I tell you what, why don't we open this as well, and you can see it might even fizz. It's been about 3 or 4 weeks in there. You can see a little tiny bubble, so you see a little bit of release there. And when you open it, you'll see there's no mold or anything like that in there. So it'll look a bit like that. So when it starts to go a little bit pink, you know it's starting to ferment. That'll turn pink in about 3 to 5 days, and it should be there about fermented. I find it best to have them within 2 or 3 weeks, but I've left them in the jar up to a month, month and a half, and as long as you don't see any mold in them, there's no reason not to consume them. And there you have it. That's how you make sauerkraut. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you next time.